Hello, this is Joe Ikley, Extension Weed Specialist with NDSU on main campus in Fargo. Today I'll be sharing the update about the Palmar Amaranth situation in North Dakota as of early November 2020. Before focusing solely on Palmar for the rest of the talk, I do want to take a brief minute here to talk about something very important with pigweed ID. I know Jeff Stockler will be talking about a whole bunch of other tips about pigweed ID during his talk, but I really want to focus on not only the hairs on the stem, but the location to look for these hairs on the stem. And the reason I want to point this out during this talk is we get a lot of samples every year of Powell Amaranth, which is often confused with Palmar Amaranth, often because Powell has very sparse hairs and can tend to have a longer seed head, as the picture on the left, compared to something like redroot pigweed, which will have a more compact seed head. So because of these longer seed heads that seem a little bit spiky and the absence of hairs on a lot of the stem, I want to show where we look for hairs on Powell. And for all pigweeds, we look for hairs at the newest growth. So in this picture on the left, I'm pointing towards where I'm zooming in for the picture on the right. And we can see here in the seed head, this newest growth, we can see the presence of many sparse white hairs on that red stem. However, if we just go a few inches down out of the seed head and into this bare part of the stem in between nodes and focusing on that, this picture on the right, we're not seeing many hairs at all, maybe a couple here in the bottom right or the bottom part of that picture. So just showing that with Powell, if we take a picture on the wrong spot of the stem, we can easily think that there's no hairs on the stem. Looks a little bit more like Palmar than some of the other pigweeds, just based on the visual appearance of the whole plant itself. And so just a quick tip or update there on where we look for hairs on all pigweeds, but especially for Powell or Palmar when looking for those hairs. Okay, so the one update I want to give here, the pigweed situation in general in 2020, I'm often asked, can we get these shock and awe type of pictures and plants in North Dakota that we see in other parts of the country? The answer is yes. Here's some Palmar Amaranth from early September in eastern North Dakota in the left picture. And the picture on the right is a Waterhemp plant about 10 miles from Fargo. This picture was sent to me in late August. We talk about pigweeds that can have over 1 million seed per plant. I'd bet this Waterhemp plant on the right was probably one of those weeds that could achieve 1 million seed on that plant. That's taller than a truck and definitely wider than that truck in the picture as well. Something I do want to focus on a little bit more this year and this winter when we talk about the pigweeds, Palmar, and Waterhemp is their prolific seed production, not just when they're big, but also when they're small. So here's a Waterhemp plant that germinated the 3rd week of August, and I came back the 2nd week of September to look at this plant and many others and see what they had done in that short period. Here's a Waterhemp plant that was about 3 inches tall, and on these seed heads, I was able to thresh and count out about 88 seed in that short 3 to 4 week window of this plant, from germination to mature seed, and about 88 of them in that small plant. So just goes to show, when we talk about managing the soil seed bank, this plant went from 1 seed to about 90 seed in a very short period, and in a time of the year where there may not be competition if you're following up with wheat, for instance. So this happened within a post-wheat harvest window, and post-wheat harvest Waterhemp management is something we'll probably need to look at a little bit closer in the future as well. But going back towards Palmar Amaranth, the core of my talk here today is giving the update of the current situation in the state. So here's a map by the Department of Agriculture that is the official bookkeepers of everywhere that Palmar Amaranth has been confirmed in the state. The counties in blue were 2018, orange were 2019, and green were 2020. You'll see Benson and Richland are striped blue and green, and that is because we found plants at an additional site within each county in 2020, so a separate site than the 2018 findings. And the other 3 new cases in 2020 were Stutsman, Barnes, and Cass counties. I want to focus in a little bit on those orange counties from 2019. This is where we found Palmar Amaranth in millet fields in late August and early September. And here's a couple pictures of what that looked like when we walked these fields. So in this particular case, we had a pretty healthy millet crop about chest high, and you can see the Palmer Amaranth sticking up about a foot or so above these millet canopies. In this particular field, we had about 1 plant per acre. We did have some other fields with a higher infestation level than that. But one of the things that we wanted to ask when we found these plants in early September, this field here in the pictures was planted early July, and we wanted to know in this 2-month window with a pretty competitive crop, did we have mature seed? Is it viable if we hand pull everything at this time and then bring it back and see if there is viable seed, what's it resistant to? So the answer is the seed viable. We stripped those seed heads and planted whatever chaff we got into flats in the greenhouse. I'll admit we did not find too many black seed when we stripped those seed heads, but when we planted the chaff, we did have plenty of plants germinate. So just a reminder there that we may not easily find black seed, or even the brown seed tends to be viable, but we can certainly have plants with plenty of viable seed. And this is about 4 weeks after planting these in the greenhouse, what we're looking at. So several ranges of plants, large to small, and that just represents different germination timings of the pigweed seeds. We then sprayed a couple flats. We sprayed one with about 1.5 pounds of glyphosate. And this picture on the right represents a flat that we sprayed with 10 pounds of glyphosate, which is about a 2.5 gallon rate of Roundup Power Max per acre. And you'll see that we have a lot of dead plants, so not all of them are that resistant, but we did have some survivors. So is it coming in with glyphosate resistance? The answer there is yes. So going back to our overall map of the state, 2019, those millet fields, they were walked again in 2020, and we did not find repeat Palmer plants. So the plants that were found and hand pulled or otherwise managed, we did not find at least evidence of viable seed that germinated and persisted into late summer. So good news there. Seems like those may be managed, but we need to stay on top of those for another couple years to be sure. Foster, McIntosh, and Dickey County were also walked. Did not find any repeat plants. We did find in Richland County a couple repeat plants. That's probably under control, contained to the one farm operation. Benson, I don't know what the update was there, but we did find another new infestation, moderately sized, likely a year or two old, and custom combine is what we think was the introduction up there. The rest of the 4 findings this year were all somewhat related to contaminated feed. And so I want to show you a picture from eastern North Dakota. We walked several fields where we did find Palmer, and basically the way we found Palmer was following the manure. And I'll just kind of walk you through the story of this particular case and what we found when we showed up to this operation. So we met at a cornfield where the suspect pigweeds were predominantly found. And this is what we found at the field entrance. So one thing that's good to know about Palmer is that it does thrive in marginal areas. And so you can see the other dominant weed in these 2 pictures here is kochia. So kochia, one of our tough weeds statewide, and of course, can thrive in marginal areas. Palmer, pretty much the same thing. So we don't have 10-foot tall plants in these pictures, but we do have plants surviving and clearly producing seed in compacted gravelly soil. As we walked further into the field and field edge, again, cornfield, plenty of manure ahead of it, so all the nitrogen that a pigweed could ever want. We know these weeds tend to thrive in high fertility environments. And this is actually what Palmer was looking like on the edge of the soybean field that butts up next to the cornfield. When we walked into the corn, it wasn't hard to find plants like this on the right. So this represents an 11 and a 12-foot tall plant that we pulled out of corn. Now, something that I like to point out here is that if you look at these plants, the biomass accumulation in the top half of the plant is much greater than the bottom half. So these plants, can compete with corn. They will certainly reduce yield if we have enough plants, but it's just an interesting biological trait here to show that Palmer will adapt and put a lot of biomass and energy into that top part of the canopy where it can collect the most light And once it no longer needs leaf tissue in the bottom half of the canopy, sheds that, and we get these pretty top-heavy plants that are trying to maximize their biomass and seed production. Again, and here's just a picture on that field margin between the corn and the soybean. This cornfield was pretty loaded. I'm not showing pictures that were knee to chest high, barely surviving in a crop canopy, but there was some sunlight getting through that corn canopy. And then the Palmer was generally knee to chest high in the soybean crop, thriving generally pretty well in this area, as you can see by the picture. As we approach the feedlot to assess the situation, try and find Palmer manure or feed sources, we can see some Palmer plants in soybean fields and alfalfa field. And so generally we had Palmer somewhat all over this operation. It's probably been there for a couple years. Evidence of probably some machine equipment spread, and then also wherever cattle were turned loose to graze, we could find Palmer there. And so that's a really important thing. When we talk about ways that Palmer can become introduced into our state, feed is certainly one source, and that kind of leads into proper feed and manure management, which will have some more resources coming out throughout the winter months about not only Palmer, but other weed seed management and feed and manure sources, because that's going to be an important thing to evaluate moving forward. So we, of course, were able to find Palmer growing on manure piles as well. The picture on the left just shows some pretty mature plants on the top of a pile, but we also had pretty small plants as well. So the picture on the right, these are pictures taken on the same day in early September. The reason I bring this up is we talk about the long germination window of Waterhemp, and Palmer is the exact same thing. So germination probably starts somewhere around June 1, and we were finding evidence of new germinating plants well into late September at this site. So, this plant will germinate and try to go to seed whenever that seed senses it has a window of opportunity to get that accomplished. The benefit for education here is we did still have some piles of the suspected contaminated feed, and in this case, here in 2020, this location, it was contaminated sunflower screenings. And so you can see this picture here on the left. We've got volunteer sunflower certainly growing out of this pile. You can see a little cotyledon in the middle part of the picture, and when you zoom in, that is a pigweed cotyledon. So we did take about 20 pounds of this feed back to campus, sorted through it, tried to count the pigweed seed in the sample, and we were finding anywhere from 500 to 1,000 pigweed seed per pound. Got it genetically tested, and it came back as 100% Palmer Amaranth. So in this case, a heavily infested feed source that is coming in with Palmer Amaranth, and we can genetically test that through the National Genotyping Center on campus. We cannot otherwise identify Palmer seed from other pigweed seeds by looking at them. We do have to use a DNA test for that. But since we had these seed, we also planted out the screenings. So we know that in this case, it costs about $40 to $50 per ton for this feed source. And so we planted out 1/4 pound of this feed source to see what else was in there. So this flat on the screen shows 1/4 pound of this feed source. The plants that you see are predominantly pigweed, and they are all Palmer Amaranth. But we do have some other weeds like velvet leaf, which is not very common in North Dakota. We have some foxtails, some sorghum, some common lamb's quarters. So a variety of weeds that we also would have to manage that are coming in from this feed source as well. But of course, the most concerning one in this case is Palmer Amaranth. If you want to put some numbers to this, if you do the math on about 45 pounds per ton, this is 1/4 pound. This is what half a penny can buy you. So as a weed scientist, that's a cheap way to get some Palmer seed to work with. But this is not what we want coming to our operations for in our feed. So relatively inexpensive feed, but that's going to be an expensive problem over the next couple of years to clean up all this Palmer that is now on this particular operation and potentially other operations out there. So in this year, it seemed like it was sunflower screenings that we were finding Palmer hitching a ride with. That's not going to be the only source. We know from Wisconsin in other states to the south and east of us that cotton feed is a source of palmer infestation. This is a picture taken during my time in Indiana, hay bales from a area of the country that has some palmer issues. So feed sources, I'd say in general, if they're originating in an area of the country where palmer is the predominant weed, can certainly be problematic for us as far as a source of infestation. And we do know it can pass through the seed can pass through cattle and other animals and be spread around in manure. So it's going to take some more intensive management of the feed and manure if we do have palmer or other noxious weeds coming in through these sources. So typically it's a time now where I would take questions, but instead I'll just put my contact information here. I will be available during the panel session and I will entertain any questions there. Thank you.